While role-playing in Dungeons & Dragons, free will is truly the name of the game. Nearly everything is open-ended, and your choice. You decide what your character does and says, and that is only limited by your imagination. You decide to approach the hooded stranger in the tavern. You decide to join her in order to free her brother that's held prisoner by a troll. And you ultimately decide whether or not to use your broadsword on that troll, or to stay a distance and use your bow and arrow instead. And it's when you get to this point that your fate is ultimately sealed by the rolls of the dice that you make. D&D has a lot of dice with some pretty strange shapes, and more often than not, the dice come into play when battle occurs. A Dungeons & Dragons dice set is typically made up of 7 different types of dice. There's the D20, the D12, the D10, the D8, the D6, and the D4. There are typically 2 D10s in order to make up percentages, but we'll get into what that means in just a second. I'm going to start by discussing the D20, mainly because it's most essential to D&D's gameplay. You will by far be using this more than any other die in the game. In combat, it determines who strikes first and how accurate that strike is. Let's also say that the evil tree's bark is really tough, and it has an AC of 14. This means you'll need to roll either a 14 or higher in order to land a strike against this tree. Now, this explanation is obviously quite simplified. There's plenty of factors that can come into play. Let's say, for instance, your sword gives you a bonus to your attack, a +1. So then you only have to roll a 13 as opposed to a 14 in order to land a strike. And once you've hit your opponent, assuming you're able to, you'll need to determine the extent of the damage that you've done, and that's where the rest of these dice come into play. One die that's almost exclusively used to determine damage is the D12. You and your opponents only have so many hit points, or life points. If you're able to bring your opponent down to 0 hit points, they're dead. If you're able to hit your enemy as determined by the D20, you then find out how much damage you've done by rolling this D12. Some of the largest weapons and spells in the game do between 1 and 12 points of damage in a single blow. Let's say this orc you're facing has only 5 hit points. If you roll an 8 on this bad boy after doing some damage, they're dead. Much like the D12, the D10 is used for determining damage in specific types of weapons and spells. Additionally, your 2 D10s can be used when your dungeon master determines that something has a percentage chance of succeeding. Usually in a set, the 2 D10s will be different colors. You will determine which color represents the first one and which represents the second. Say you choose the blue die to represent the second one and the green die to represent the first. You roll the green and it has a 6, you roll the blue and it has a 4. This is a 64, or a 64%. As an in-game example, let's say you come to a rickety bridge atop a raging river. You have heavy armor on, but you decide to cross the bridge anyway. Based on your other attributes, your DM determines that you have a 34% chance of falling into the river below. If you roll a 34% or higher, you're able to cross the bridge. But if you roll a 33% or lower, you fall into the river below. Whether or not you drown is based completely on other dice rolls that you make after that occurs. Much like the D12 and the D10, the D8 is also used for determining damage with certain types of weapons. It is most commonly paired with weapons that only need one hand in order to wield, so you'll see a lot of characters that use sword and shield combos, typically reverting to this type of dice. The sword and shield combo is of course very popular with warrior types, and it will tend to gravitate towards weapons that can do the most damage while still allowing the added protection of this shield. Those weapons often do between 1 and 8 points of damage, and so they require the D8. D100s are pretty circumstantial and are good for things like boulder damage and stuff like that, or for punishing that one player that won't get off their phone. You know who you are. The next die is undoubtedly familiar to you, and that's the D6. It's shaped just like every other 6-sided die that you've seen in games like Monopoly, Risk, and so on and so forth. The only difference mainly being that they have the numbers written on them as opposed to the dots. Why this is done, I can't exactly tell you, but I imagine it's just easier to count up a bunch of D6s that have the numbers on them as opposed to all of these dots. Like the others so far, the D6 is primarily used for calculating damage output. And finally, we reach the smallest die in the game, but also one of the most strange ones, the D4, the pyramid-looking die in your set. The D4 determines the damage for the smallest weapons found in D&D. It's one of the strangest of all the dice, mainly because it has several numbers along each side. When rolling a D4, the result is determined by the number that's along the bottom edge of your die. Turning the die, you'll see the number on all 3 sides. It will also be the only number that appears right side up, rather than at an angle like the rest of them. You only need to look at one side of the 4-sided die to determine the numerical outcome, as that number will be the same on the other 2 sides. D&D dice are as interesting to look at as they are to roll, and their use doesn't have to be limited to Dungeons & Dragons either. They can easily be used in other tabletop games or even board games in order to add a little bit of extra flavor. I've been known to use D8s or D10s in Risk in order to make certain battles and encounters a bit more of a bloodbath or to move through a bit quicker. And in games I don't really like, for instance like Monopoly, you can use D8s or D10s or even D12s in order to move around that board a lot quicker. Either way, their use is really only determined by your imagination, and I highly recommend getting a set that you're proud of. Now, you don't have to get a chainmail bag like I do, per se, but I definitely recommend getting dice that you can be happy with when the group comes over and that you can show off to all your friends. My name's Patrick Ferguson. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys next time.